Hey, this is Austin, and this is the first video I've made where I'm actually excited because I know what I want to say. I originally started making content because I'm releasing an album and needed promotion. I quickly realized I had no idea what I'm doing and that I don't really align with modern social media. So recently, I've deleted TikTok, limited my Instagram posts, and shifted towards long-form YouTube content. It's taken me about 6 months to get here, but I finally know what I want to say. And I'm refusing to let the attention economy decide the shape of my thoughts. Part of that is just making things. I've been making covers in my apartment and garage band, usually spending no more than a day on each one. They're not meant to be perfect. I'm doing them because I want to understand music better, taking songs apart, rebuilding them, and learning why they work. I also want a record of the process. I'm not just releasing an album and trying to convince people I'm an artist. I've been living this, and I want the channel to reflect that instead of just promoting a finished product. And I think I finally figured out what the other half of this channel is. I want to talk about what I think about, the books I read, the movies I watch, history, religion, philosophy, and the connections between them. So this is the first part of a three-part series. All three parts connect to the world my album came out of, but I'm not going to explain those connections. If they're there, you should be able to find them. So with that being said, Christopher Nolan's Odyssey changed my life and connected neural paths that led me into something I think is actually an old human structure of meaning. The idea that trust, violation, and return are bound together by something like moral debt. The film doesn't present this idea all at once. It builds it in layers. It starts with Xenia. In ancient Greece, Xenia wasn't just hospitality. It was a sacred law of Zeus governing the relationship between host and guest. It created a mutual obligation, protection, respect, and trust on both sides. Nolan reframes this in a way modern audiences can immediately feel. Xenia becomes something closer to the golden rule. Treat others as you want to be treated. Not just etiquette, but a baseline condition for human trust. Once you see it in that way, breaking Xenia isn't just rudeness or even betrayal in a narrow sense. It becomes a kind of moral debt, a rupture in the system that makes trust possible at all. And the film gives that rupture a symbol, the Trojan horse. Odysseus doesn't conquer Troy through force. He wins by entering the city through trust itself, offering something that depends entirely on being believed, and then exploiting that belief. So the first step in Nolan's structure is this: trust creates a bond, and violating that bond creates a debt. That idea of trust being sacred and fragile immediately reminded me of Dante. In Inferno, Dante places betrayal in the ninth circle of hell, the deepest, most frozen point, with Satan trapped at the center. What matters here isn't just that betrayal is punished, it's where it is placed, at the absolute bottom of moral reality. Dante is pointing to something structural. Betrayal isn't just harm, it is the destruction of a relationship that had already been established. It only exists because trust existed first. So if Nolan shows us how trust can be weaponized, Dante shows us why that matters. Betrayal is the inversion of trust itself, and it carries the weight of everything that came before it. That's where the Trojan horse becomes clear in a deeper sense. Odysseus doesn't just break a rule of war. He takes the very thing that makes human cooperation possible, trust, and turns it into the mechanism of collapse. So if Nolan gives us the mechanism of violation and Dante gives us its moral weight, the next question becomes, what happens after that kind of rupture? Nolan answers that with sacrifice. After the collapse, the only path forward is not victory, but surrender. The film frames return not as a conquest, but as a kind of undoing of the self. Odysseus's journey home becomes less about strategy and more about loss, about what must be given up in order for restoration to even be possible. The logic is simple but severe. If trust creates debt, then restoration requires payment. And in Nolan's framing, that payment looks like sacrifice, letting go of control, identity, and even survival itself in order to re-enter a moral order that was broken. That idea of sacrifice as the condition for return is what led me to Lincoln. After leaving the theater, I started thinking about whether this structure, trust, violation, debt, sacrifice, was just mythic storytelling, or whether it shows up in how we actually talk about history. And Lincoln is one of the clearest places it does. In his second inaugural address, Lincoln doesn't claim certainty about God's will. He does something more unsettling. He speaks as if the nation itself might be operating under a kind of moral accounting. He suggests that if the Civil War is the cost of slavery, if every drop of blood drawn by the lash must be repaid by blood drawn by the sword, then that outcome would still be just. He is not declaring a verdict. He is holding open a possibility that a nation can accumulate moral debt and that history itself might function as a form of repayment. So where Nolan shows sacrifice as the condition for return, Lincoln extends the idea outward. What if entire societies are subject to the same logic of debt and repayment? That's why Lincoln feels like a bridge in this argument. He takes something that looks mythic in Nolan and Dante and applies it to a real political body, a nation trying to understand its own violence. And I didn't first encounter this in a book. I saw it carved into the stone at the Lincoln Memorial, where his words are literally set into the architecture of American memory. And then history does something almost too precise. Nearly a century later, Martin Luther King Jr. stands in that same place and gives the I Have a Dream speech. He doesn't just echo Lincoln, he reframes the moral structure in explicitly economic terms. He says America issued a promissory note guaranteeing rights and freedom, but when Black Americans came to collect, the nation defaulted. This is where the idea of moral debt becomes fully explicit. Lincoln wonders whether national suffering must be repayment for collective sin. King stands beneath those words and says the debt is still unpaid. But King also shifts the direction of the argument. He is not interpreting suffering as punishment. He is demanding restoration. The promissory note is not symbolic. It is binding. So if Lincoln opens the possibility of national moral accounting, King turns it into a claim about obligation. A debt exists, and it must be fulfilled. And when you place Nolan, Dante, Lincoln, and King in sequence, something starts to hold together. Nolan shows how trust can be broken and how return requires sacrifice. Dante shows that betrayal is the deepest form of moral rupture because it destroys trust itself. Lincoln suggests that such ruptures can accumulate at the level of entire nations as moral debt, and King insists that those debts do not disappear with time. They remain active claims on the present. So the thread connecting all of them is not just suffering or justice, but something more specific. Trust creates obligation. Violation creates debt, and debt demands resolution. And after sitting with that, my thinking turned forward. What if modern suffering isn't just random? We know individuals face consequences for their actions. We also know people can create their own hells here on earth. But what if Lincoln was right to consider that societies themselves can share in moral wrongdoing? What if civilizations accumulate debt? And if they do, what does it cost to pay it? That's where I'm going to stop part one. In part two, I want to turn that question towards us. But before I end, I also want to say something about this channel. I've realized I'm not good at improvising, meaning on demand. My best thinking doesn't come from turning on a camera and trying to be profound. I like thinking slowly. I like going down rabbit holes, making connections, revising ideas, and figuring out what I actually believe. And I like writing. So that's how I want to do this. I'll keep making music. I'll keep making covers. I'll keep reading, watching, and living. And when I find something worth saying, I'll write it down, then come here and read it. I'd rather share one idea I've actually wrestled with than 100 pieces of content made to satisfy an algorithm. And next time, I want to ask the harder question. What if we're already paying the debt?